everyone, and welcome to our next chapter in our series of stepping into and becoming your dynamic self. And today we have Colleen with us, and she has an amazing story to tell, an amazing way that she works with people to help them heal. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Colleen, and we'll get started.
Hi, everybody. My name is Colleen, and I started out my career as a trauma therapist, and I dove really deep into neuroscience and really trying to figure out what people needed in order to work on their traumas and release their traumas, because typical therapy at the time just wasn't working for a lot of people. I noticed that I was treating symptoms, like things that were on like the surface, such as like their anxiety, their hypervigilance, things like that. But we weren't actually treating the root of the problem. So they would get better because it felt good to talk about it, get it off their chest, but it wasn't actually clearing out the root. It wasn't actually releasing the trauma. And so I did a lot of deep research, and I made my own technique that now actually gets to the root of why people are feeling the way that they are. So we're no longer treating symptoms, but we are clearing things out at the root so the symptom no longer exists. And what I do in the coaching world now is I take all of that I learned, and I help entrepreneurs, business owners, high level achieving women who feel like they're ready for their next level, but also feel stuck. They might feel a little burnout. They don't know what to do next. We take a deep dive into all of those little things that might be holding them back, and we clear them out at the root. And what that does is it starts to get women into alignment. It gets them into who they truly are at the core, not what someone once told them they were, not with any limitations that they've put on themselves, but who they really are in a deep soul level. And then it allows them to flourish and decide, like, who am I really? What do I really want to be in this world? And how can I go about and create that in my life? It's beautiful to watch.
I love that. And I love that you keep focusing on the root. And I think that's like a key that so many people miss. You have to get to the root of what is causing your issues. You can't just treat it on a surface level and be out the door, no matter what you're treating it with, whether it's medication or, a plan or whatever. You have to get to the root and pull that out and get rid of it, because otherwise, you know what roots do and weeds do, they just keep coming back.
Mm-hmm.
So that is so important to address it at that level.
Right. And even so many people who have like avoidant issues where they try to avoid things, all they're doing is they're picking up their rug and they're pushing the stuff underneath it and putting it down. And then later on, it's still there, and they end up tripping over it and getting hurt from it because they never actually dealt with it. And so I see that a lot too.
Oh, yeah, that is so true. And with the women I see and work with, having a chronic illness is hard to talk about. And so a lot of it is pushed under the rug because either they don't have someone to talk to that hears them and listens to them, and then it's just automatic that you just bury it and don't want to talk about it because it's painful when you're rejected. And even at the neurologist level, you see your neurologist and you bare your soul to them and tell them what's going on, and they just dismiss you or discount you or just throw something at you to cover the symptoms. Mm-hmm. So this really needs to be like a revolution of how things are addressed. And
right. And if people are living with that, where they aren't feeling heard, they feel like no one's listening to them, then that really starts to create these little traumas. And it's like, okay, I wasn't listened to in this time, and then I wasn't listened to in this time. And it creates its own little neural network that then you have a negative belief about yourself that, like, I'm not good enough to be listened to, or something to that effect. And then you carry that with you into life, and then things just start to stack in that area. And that's not who you truly are at the core.
Mm,
So those are the things that we clear out so that it doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but it doesn't matter if other people don't hear you and listen to you, because you know your truth, you know, right? And so whether they listen or not, that's their issue about who they are being as a person, right? Like you don't have to have that need fulfilled because you're able to fulfill it in yourself.
right. And I think even goes deeper into listening to our intuition, because we know our answers are inside of us. And when we listen to our heart, like it's in there, we just have to allow it to come through, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So when we talk about trauma, a lot of people think something major, like a major car accident or abuse or any sort of violence. But I think trauma can happen, on a daily level, whether it's like you said, not being heard, not being listened to or respected, or receiving a illness diagnosis of some sort, or there are so many things that are small traumas that do stack up that we have to contend with and release.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there are traumas happening on a daily level, but because people don't necessarily understand what makes a trauma, they're not realizing what's happening in their brain and how it is stacking up. So if you're okay with it, I'd like to draw something on the screen to help people understand the neuroscience of how things are stored in your brain and how things become traumas. Does that work for you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I love to educate people on this topic because, like you said, a lot of people think it's got to be like a big trauma, but when you see what actually constitutes as a trauma, you're like, wow. Okay. So can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So this is your brain. I'm not an artist on this platform. Okay. Pretend that's a complete circle. I'm going to draw a line down the middle.
Well, our brain is kind of an oval shape anyway.
So over here, we have long-term memory. Okay. And over here, this is a very simplistic drawing to help people really just understand. Short-term memory. Okay. So what's happening? I'm just going to start with like day to day. Different colors here. Okay. So in your long-term memory, there are these dots, and they're called nodes. And they're like file cabinets. They store information. So you have a note about all the different types of cars that exist. You have a note about all the different dogs that exist, right? Different places you could travel to. So there's like so many, there's a million. And then between the nodes, try a different color here, you have this neural pathway that's going to connect all the nodes. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Very crazy drawing. But you get the idea, right?
Yes.
So they're all connected. So your brain can like talk to itself and send signals throughout your body depending on the information that's stored inside. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, in the middle of this long-term and short-term, it's as if you have this guy and he's like hanging out here, waiting to start his job. We're just going to leave him there. He's excited there. Okay. So now what happens is during the day, new information will come into your brain. Okay. So right here, today you're learning that I have a dog and his name is Murphy. So this is Murphy, this blue dot. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then tonight, when you go to sleep, what's going to happen is your filer guy, he's going to say, okay, what did we learn today? this here is in the short-term memory. This is Murphy. The node or like file cabinet for dogs is over here. So we're going to take it, we're going to store it over here. You're going to wake up tomorrow. It's going to be out of the short-term memory and in the long-term memory. You're going to remember I have a dog named Murphy and everything's going to be great. That is how our brain typically works. Okay. So you go to sleep at night, you go through different stages of sleep. One of those stages of sleep is called REM sleep, rapid eye movement. Your eyes are literally going back and forth inside of your head while you're sleeping. And it's processing the memories or the information from the day, from the short term into the long term. Now, what happens is sometimes we don't have a good day. Sometimes we might have a really bad day and something traumatic could happen. So for instance, there could be a memory of, and this is the new memory, okay? This right here is you were 7 years old, sitting on your front steps of your house, looking across the street at your friend who was having a birthday party and you weren't invited. Right? So then at night you go to sleep and your filer is like, oh, wait a minute. I don't know where this goes. I don't know where to store it. There's a ton of emotion attached to it. Your nervous system is feeling it whenever it's brought up. It's just too heavy. I can't move it. I'm just going to leave it right now. And maybe sometime in the future, there'll be a spot for it. So it stays there. And then tomorrow when you wake up, it's still just as heavy because it wasn't ever stored appropriately in your brain the way that it needed to be to lay it to rest. Okay. And then you go to school and later on that week, they're talking about the birthday party and they're talking about how you weren't invited. And that's another trauma. And then it starts to connect to this one. And then maybe a year later, there's another birthday party, right? Or maybe there was another thing with friends that happened, but it's related. So it starts to make its own little network over here in the short-term memory. Is this making sense? So every single thing that's stored in the short-term memory that's not moving over to the long-term memory, it holds a negative belief about yourself.
Wow.
And sometimes it takes a minute of me working with the client because it's hard to identify a negative belief, right? So at first they might be like, well, I wasn't invited. And I'll say, okay, let's go a little deeper. What does it mean about you that you weren't invited? And then they're like, okay, like I don't belong, right? That's a negative belief. Or I don't fit in. That's a negative belief. So maybe asking yourself the question and take it one step deeper of what does that mean about you? Because we always take things personally. So there's a negative belief, and then it's always stored in your body. So when I ask you to think about that memory of you sitting on the front steps, looking at that house across the street with a birthday party going on, knowing that you weren't invited, where do you feel it in your body? And people always have an answer when they tune into their body of where it is.
Wow. Yes.
So this is what I do with people. I clear out the negative belief. I clear out the body. The event that bothered them, I move it over to the long-term memory so that it no longer bothers them. And that's the work that I do with people. It's just chipping away at these things that are stored in the short-term memory that they didn't even realize were there most of the time. And what that does is that starts to free people and it starts to build their confidence. Instead of having a negative belief about themselves, we flip it with a positive. And that's what's building the confidence. And that's what's them stepping into their truth. Because this negative belief came from somewhere outside of themselves. They weren't born with it. Right?
Right.
So when we have a negative belief about ourselves, the best thing that we can do is say, where did this come from? Because I wasn't born that way. I wasn't born with these negative beliefs, right? So this could really be anything. So the short term, if people have a problem like going live in Facebook for their business, that's connected to something in the past. Maybe it was when you were in 8th grade and you had to give an English presentation, you had to sit on your forehead and everyone was laughing at you. Right? There's always something that you can like tie it back to. So this is actually trauma work. So you can identify a trauma, no matter how big or how small, because if it's in the short-term memory, when you think about it, like when you really get into that memory and think about it, it's going to bother you. I always ask people between 0 and 10, where 10 is like the most disturbing thing you could imagine. How much does it bother you when you think about it? And if you can give me a number between 1 and 10, it's still in the short term. It's not moved over. And it's affecting you currently somehow in your life. It's showing up.
Wow, that's so interesting. And there's so many, I mean, if everybody thinks back to, like you said, just when you were young, like in school, because you're with these kids all the time and they're just all mean to each other. I mean, it's just, I'm sure there's so many things that are just stacked up, like you said before.
Do you have questions about this before I take it off the screen?
So when you don't get a good night's sleep, I've read that your thoughts that are in your short-term memory don't get recycled. And then that could be contributing to why you feel tired and foggy and can't think clearly the next day.
It could be because you have to go through the different stages of sleep. And what happens is you go through the different stages and then it recycles and it happens again and it happens again. So if you're only going through that 1 or 2 cycles per night, or if maybe you're waking up before you get through a full cycle, that by cycle, I mean like the stages, right? Then you're not able to do this. A lot of people that have like sleep apnea, their memory starts to get foggy because of this. They're not able to move the information from the short term to the long term and it starts to get lost.
So if you don't have good sleep one night and then you have great sleep the next night, is there still short-term memory? I mean, do they think that's still lingering, that you haven't had enough sleep to clear that out?
I don't know how it works with inconsistent sleep. All I know is that you need to get to REM sleep in order for it to move over.
Okay.
So I'm just assuming if they're not getting the REM sleep that they need, then things aren't being stored appropriately.
Right. And there's so many people that you ask how they are and they say, I'm tired. It's like millions of people in America take sleep aids, and whether that really helps them get their good sleep or not, I don't know, because I think a lot of times your body just becomes used to that and it's not really even effective anymore. So stacking those, I don't think is a good idea either.
Yeah. So sleep aids is like a whole nother thing. I first started my career as a therapist as an addictions counselor. And so I know a lot about drugs and how it affects the brain, and not just like illegal drugs, but also not illegal drugs, right? So I know that people believe that melatonin is super helpful for sleeping at night. But I also know that what happens in the brain is when you take melatonin, your brain is like, oh, I'm getting something, so I don't need to make as much of it because you're giving it to me. And so it actually starts to deplete the natural melatonin that's being made in your brain, because your brain's saying, I don't need to make it, you're going to give it to me. And then when you stop using the melatonin, your sleep is even worse because your body is not naturally producing it anymore. And so it has to start building up the production of the melatonin to get back to where you even were when you started. So it's like once you take it, then you're kind of dependent on it.
Interesting. So what are your thoughts on like CBD for sleeping?
I don't know as much about CBD in order to like make a comment about it. I think that the best thing that people could do is more natural things and not take something. I believe that for a lot of people, we can do things and we don't need to actually take anything in order to cure what's happening within us to get us to where we want to be. I think there are reasons why people need medication or why people might need CBD. But I also think for the majority of us, we're told that we need medications. We're told that we need certain things, and we we can do things in our life to get us to that point without having to take something. And I think it's healthier for us.
Yes, I believe that too. And I think because it's ingrained in us that we have to take things, then people are like looking for, maybe it's something natural to take, or maybe they're just taking the melatonin.
Mm-hmm. And I think another part of it is people just get so busy and they get caught up in everything that they're doing. They're like, I don't have time for XYZ to make myself better. So I just have to take this thing because it's easier and it's quicker. And I want results now because I'm busy.
Yes.
So we really need to just slow down.
Yeah. I think that's our culture. Results right now. I feel terrible and I want to feel wonderful tomorrow. So get me there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And I think even when we change our diet, cutting out the things that don't make us feel good, whether it's gluten or fast food or, the sugars or caffeines, it takes a while to clear that out of our body, first of all. And then second of all, to, do a reset. So I think when you're trying something new, that's important to think of when you're starting, and just starting with small steps. So you don't get overwhelmed no matter what you're doing.
Right. Instead of having those negative beliefs about ourselves, how can we be kind to ourselves? How can we give ourselves grace and patience so that we can achieve the results that we want?
Right.
Because the more that we have those negative thoughts, that's actually creating more stress in our body and holding on to things when we're trying to release them.
Mm-hmm. So valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Just be our own best friend.
Yes.
I agree. So how do people get in touch with you or find your work or?
So probably the best way would just to be email me. So it's Colleen. No, it's alchemy@colleenaloyan.com. My last name is Aloian.
Sure. And we'll post it below as well.
Okay.
So I think what you're doing is wonderful. And like you said, and it took me a while to realize this too, that, so many things that happen to us, like not getting invited to the birthday party and then everybody talking about it. Yes, you were 7. And then there's people that say, well, you're over it. How old are you now? Get over it. But you can't. It's in your brain and it's stored. Your body remembers it. And until you take the time to work through it, it's going to keep coming up for you, no matter how old you are.
And it's where emotional intelligence comes into play too, because when we're triggered or activated into that memory from when we were younger, we actually start to have that personality of when we were younger. And then people aren't having the emotional intelligence because, as we know, as when emotions are high, the intelligence is not so high, right? So when we're being activated by these past things, number one, it's hard to even identify where is this coming from. But then number two, to not be in that state that you were when you went through that event, to actually be like the person that you are today. It's tough. So that's why it's so important to clear out these things that are in our past that we might not even know are really affecting us in our relationships and our business and how we show up as a mom and all the things.
Yeah, it really can create a ripple effect, going either way. We want our kids to be healthy and have a good mindset, but we have to help ourselves first, like putting on our oxygen mask first on the plane.
Right. And another big thing that I want to point out before we end today is it also changes our perception of the world around us and the people in our world too. Because a lot of the time what can happen is we're so in what happened to us and that negative belief about ourselves that we start to think that it's like someone else's fault, right? We're often like blaming parents about how we grew up, or we're often blaming our friend or blaming somebody else and not taking responsibility. And as we clear out these little traumas, what we see is we see the person for who they really are. We see the person as, and we have compassion for them. Like maybe they didn't know any better. Maybe they were just so in their own trauma that they were responding from that. And it actually means nothing about us, but we made it mean something about us. Right.
Mm.
So as we clear these things out, we actually start to have better relationships with people because we're not blaming them anymore. We're seeing them for who they are and we're having some compassion for them.
That's so good.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, I hope I should have warned everybody at the beginning to have a notebook, but I'll put that in the notes too. Make sure you have a notebook for this session. Tons of good info. So thank you so much. And I appreciate you sharing today. And just if this helps one person heal something, then I think we've accomplished something.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much for having me on today. I really appreciate this. I hope somebody was able to learn something. And some homework that I give people is just to start at the earliest memory that you have. Like maybe you're 5 years old and say, okay, is there anything from when I was 5 that bothered me? If no, move on to age 6. If yes, write it down. And you'll start to see all of the things that still bother you that could be worked on or could be connected to something somewhere. And so that's a really good exercise. If you're like, do I have anything? That's a great way to kind of start figuring that out.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That's a great exercise.
So thank you so much for having me on today.
Yes.
It was
Thank
great
you.
to see you again.
Yes. Thank you. And we'll have to do this again because I think unlocking each of these layers in ourselves just frees us, frees us to be who we're here to be, who we're meant to be, and, show our kids the best, path of how to be. So,
yeah, that's really what it's about.
Well, thank you. And we will see everyone soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.